All right, so chapter 13. So let's talk for just a minute about your first initial response when you're a responding officer. What's your first priority? Well, your first priority, and it's not in this textbook, but the true first priority is to make sure the scene is safe before you approach. Your second priority is to render aid, render aid to the victims. That's not in your book either. And then your third priority is to protect the scene. We want to protect the scene, and we want to begin to gather evidence because that's just so important in this day and age where jurors expect us to have the type of evidence that they're seeing on TV, the CSI evidence, you know. And so if we're losing evidence at the crime scene, um, we're gonna have a harder time in that when we go to the jury because it's really has changed. They really expect the evidence. They don't want to hear admissions. They don't want to hear opinions. They want to see evidence, hard evidence that we collect. So some of our top priorities basically is protecting the crime scene and then gathering evidence. You know, and evidence is changing. You know, the evidence that we used to have is no longer as impressive. So let's talk about fingerprints for a minute. You know, actually, let me turn over that page because we got a couple things to talk about with fingerprints. So let's talk about fingerprints for a minute. So it used to be just good enough to dust for prints. I used powder-based dust, and you dust it for prints, and then you get your fingerprint, and there you have it. Well, now there's all kinds of things we can do with fingerprints. The first thing we can do with fingerprints is a lot of times with paper we can't dust for those prints, you know, because our oils, so fingerprint powder is picking up those oils in your hands, and so, you know, if the document is old or you know a little bit if it's an older document or you know it's been out there for a week or two, and those oils you know aren't there for the powder to attach to, you can still have fingerprints on that page. One way that we collect those fingerprints is through ninhydrin. Now, ninhydrin you can use two different things. The primary way that I use ninhydrin is with a spray. And so I take that document and I just spray it down with ninhydrin. I make it saturated. And then that ninhydrin over a 24-hour period will bring out the fingerprints for you. Now, a couple things to remember about the spray. First off, you definitely want to do it outside because it will smell up the room. The second thing that's important to know is that if ninhydrin contacts your skin, it will stain it purple for a very long time. So when you're spraying that spray, you need to definitely wear your gloves and also wear a long sleeve shirt because you can usually tell when someone wasn't wearing a long sleeve shirt because they'll have this like mark where their gloves were and then a purple arm going up to the elbows. So there's the ninhydrin spray, and then there's also the immersion ninhydrin that you can actually put the document inside of an ninhydrin liquid, let it soak, pull it out, let it dry 24 hours. You'll have fingerprints. Will show up right there on the card. Then we have an iodine test that I prefer. This is probably the easiest and most effective for me. It is you basically just take a big Ziploc bag. You have some iodine, like little iodine crystals. You put the iodine crystals in the bag. You put the piece of paper in the bag, and you start warming up those ninhydrin crystals. The iodine crystals, and it will create a little fume in there, and it will actually turn all of your fingerprints brown. Then you pull them out. And there's a setter because if you pull out the piece of paper and you just let it sit out, the fingerprint will disappear. So there's a setter that you use that you put on that fingerprint, and it sets that print permanent. You gotta be careful with the iodine because it is a chemical, a deadly chemical that you don't want to be. You want to be outside or underneath a hood when you do that because you're using those fumes. Then there's this great technique called supergluing. And this is probably the messiest, but probably truly the most effective. Ninhydrin is cool. Iodine is fun and fast. But probably the most effective is supergluing. And that's basically where you take a fish tank. You take a little metal tin. You just put some superglue on that metal tin. You warm up the metal tin. You put a little bit of water in that fish tank. You put the metal tin in the fish tank while it's warming. And the fumes from that super glue kind of attach to that hydrated air from the water. And then you'll have your item in there. It can be a can. It can be whatever you want. And those super glue fumes, those hydrated superglue fumes will attach to the oils of that fingerprint, and you'll have a permanent fingerprint. It's a really nice thing about superglue is that it's permanent. It makes it solid. We even superglue whole cars sometimes. Sometimes we'll seal up a car, and we'll set our superglue inside, and we'll treat the car like it's a fish tank. Now the problem with that is when you superglue something, you ruin that item for future use. It's really hard to restore items that have been superglued because it's just covered. The whole item's covered in superglue. One of the advantages of superglue, though, is it's the least intrusive on that fingerprint. So why do we care if it's intrusive or not? Because technology is really, really changing in this aspect. One great new piece of technology in fingerprinting is what they call touch DNA. And DNA has become so advanced that just from a fingerprint, the oils that were in your hand to create that fingerprint, I can do a swab and pull DNA off of that. If you use an anhydride or use iodine, it's destroying that DNA, it's burning it off. But if you use the superglue, it's preserving that DNA and you haven't lost the DNA. So it's one of the advantages of using the superglue over the other items, because powder and superglue will not ruin your touch DNA. Iodine and anhydride will. Let's talk about a really big case that affects our evidence collection, how we do things. Kylo versus the United States. I hate this case. This is the worst possible case that could have happened for law enforcement. So basically what officers were doing is they kind of had suspicions of a drug house. They used infrared technology to sit. Now they sat on a public street and videotaped this house. They were in public view. They weren't on the person's property. They weren't invasive. But they used an infrared camera to see the escape of heat from this house. And they were able to show the judge, listen, normal houses don't have this kind of heat. The only house, excuse me, the only kind of house that has this kind of heat is a house that has a grow house in it. And so they use that as part of their reason to get a warrant. And so what the court says is, no, you can't do that, because most people don't have infrared technology. That's not a normal thing that people are using. There is an expectation that the police won't be using that technology on them. And so that's a really tough one for us in law enforcement, because it really limited us. Now, can we use binoculars? Sure, because that's a normal thing that people have. So we kind of want to see some of these normal things, these abnormal things, infrared, those kinds of things, start taking effect in society, because we can start using those things. So, let's see here. I wanted to make a note about, court. So there's mainly two questions that are asked in court that you really have to consider. The first question is, where did the evidence come from? Let's see that chain of custody. Let's make sure that chain wasn't broken, that I didn't visit anybody or go outside the department. We want to know where that evidence came from. The second piece that we had to find is, the science of that technology, the science of that evidence. And is that science reliable and acceptable? DNA wasn't reliable and acceptable for a while. Now it is. So those are the two questions that the court's going to ask. Where did it come from? What's your chain of evidence? And then is the science reliable? And as we have more technology coming into advancement, they keep having to ask that question. We keep having to have experts come in and testify to it. An interesting thing I saw was in this chapter, something that I didn't know, is that England was actually the first country to have a DNA database. And so I thought that was pretty interesting, that you would think that some of that stuff is all American, but realistically in this case with DNA it was England. So that was interesting. And of course in America we use the CODIS database, to collect to put our DNA samples into, that will test against a lot of things. I think the last thing I wanted to talk to you about, I'm sorry about the shakiness, I'm not at a place where I can put my iPad down, but yeah, the last thing I want to talk to you about is digital photographs. So we're all using digital photographs now, but there's some real important things that we have to consider. The first major hurdle that we had to jump over, and some jurisdictions still aren't there, but the first major hurdle that we had to jump over was, can we use that that digital photograph without having the original memory card? Okay, and so you think about, you're taking those digital photographs, you're taking them, you transfer them over to a CD. Can you submit that CD into evidence? Most judges now, and like I said, sometimes it's regional, but most judges now say if the officer testifies that there was no manipulation of the images from the card to the CD, then it is acceptable. Now I'll tell you, for major cases, we don't even mess with that. We just take that card out and we just chalk it up as a loss. We take the card, we log the card in as evidence, and that's that. So that's the first thing you have to remember about digital evidence. Second thing you have to remember about digital evidence, and this is getting officers in trouble across the nation. Cops love to get their, what we call, prize picture, right? So they get this big, I can remember the first time I had a big marijuana bust. I mean, I wanted to get my picture standing next to those, 60 pounds of marijuana, and so they're pulling out their cell phones and taking those pictures. Well, what does that make your cell phone? That makes your cell phone evidence. The picture you took is evidence, and you have to be very careful about that. You record people for a criminal investigation on your cell phone using your cell phone recorder. That is now evidence. We have got to be careful about that. And the last thing I'll say is, when you're taking those digital pictures, technology has changed. So I can take a picture, I can look at it and say, oh, I don't need that picture, and delete it. Take another picture, oh, that picture is fuzzy, delete it. Well, what are you doing? Well, you're destroying evidence when you do that. You say, well, I didn't need that picture. Well, the defense attorney is going to say, you don't know that. You can't tell me that you could tell on a little 2-inch screen if you captured evidence that could have exonerated my client. So keep those fuzzy pictures. Keep those pictures that don't turn out right. Keep all that. We have to be very careful that we don't give defense attorneys an opportunity to question our evidence. So with that said, like I said, sorry about the balancing picture. I'll try to do better for you next week. Have a great day. Have a great week. I hope this helps you out.